consequences.
Can be like blacks were earlier as slaves living in US. So
Yeah.
they can't marry whites, so they train to be slaves for multiple generations. And
Yeah.
white being their owner for multiple generations, so only white can have the maximum amount of wealth, and blacks, even outnumbering the whites in terms of population, cannot contain the wealth.
Yeah. So okay. So I'm not just pointing to the fact that there was a system of slavery as well that was happening at the same time, and so that had important economic consequences in terms of wealth accumulation, right? And so if you see, and those disparities continue to this day, and so interracial marriage was part of this social attitude that blacks and whites are different from each other, and this has had important economic consequences even today, right? Where you see poverty amongst blacks, much high African Americans is much higher than poverty amongst non-African Americans, right? And so similarly, there were other kinds of social attitudes that work as well. So women's suffrage, right? In the US, there was a view that women should not be voting. What's the need for women to vote when their husbands and fathers will vote for them, right? So we don't need for women to vote. Their husbands and fathers will vote for them, and so there's no reason to have women voting. And so this was a strongly held view, and in fact, it took a long struggle by many women voters, large suffrage movement, right? And final constitutional amendment which allowed women to vote in 1920. In India, of course, we've had universal suffrage from the beginning of straight from independence. But in the US, this was a long struggle to happen, right? Because there was a social attitude that said women should not vote, women need not vote, right? Because anyway, we're accounting for their views through their husbands and their fathers, right? So this was a social attitude at work in the US. And so similarly, there have been social attitudes right now. Abortion is very much in the news. If you look up, abortion Texas law, just Google those terms, and you will find a large amount of social disruption because of this idea. Because people have strongly held social views. Some have very strongly held social views, what are called pro-choice views. Women should have the right to choose to do with their bodies as they wish. Others say, no, wait a minute, there's a life at stake, right? So these are very strongly held social views, and they have an impact on how society actually happens, right? So similarly, there's been a strong evolution of same-sex marriage as well as recreational marijuana more recently, and you can see these things happening in the news, right? So as we speak. And so what this is pointing to me, right? What this is pointing to me is that social attitudes, right? One, you can imagine that these social attitudes have an economic impact, right? So if you look at the economy, clearly things like same-sex marriage or abortion will have an impact, say, on how women can, how much mobility do they have, how many children will they have, and these will have important economic consequences. So social attitudes, which are at the base of it, are going to have an important consequence further down the road, right? And second, I thought, when I think about stuff like this, I think that social attitudes can evolve. Some social attitudes evolve slowly. How long did it take for the US to accept interracial marriage? It took them 190 years, right? Some social attitudes evolve very quickly. And you can see on this chart, right? So it took only 12 years for same-sex marriage to become a constitutional right. Only 12 years compared to 190 years, right? So society can evolve, and some of these things can have large economic consequences, right? So in that sense, these are important. So in India, do we have some social attitudes which have important economic consequences? Any volunteers point this out?
Reservations.
Okay, so people have strong view on reservations, right? So this is in India we have caste, now economic-based reservations, right? And so people have strong social views on that, and that impacts mobility of individuals, both socially as well as economically, right? And it says something about the composition of our white-collar workforce, right? So that is important. So Tamanna has pointed that out. What else?
Child marriage.
Hardik?
Child marriage.
Child marriage, right? So if you talk to people a generation back or 2 generations back, would they be in favor of child marriage under the age of 18? Yes, right. So many people were in favor of it, and they would they would forward arguments in favor of child marriage. And today, what is perhaps the dominant view amongst most people? Soumya, what do you think? You have your hand up.
Women suffering in India is still prevalent.
Okay, so Soumya says that child marriage is basically leads to a lot of suffering amongst young women, right? And so she seems to be against this idea of child marriage. Mudit, what do you think? So Mudit, you're not on mute, but we can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Oh yeah. So I probably think the most polarizing and most important view right now would be that of religion.
Okay.
Which religion you follow, which religion you do not like, most importantly.
Yeah.
Which also leads to a lot of both obviously economic and social repercussions.
So Mudit is saying that look, social attitudes around religion seem to have an important consequence. So remember, the social attitude is not about what religion you yourself have followed, right? You can follow whatever religion you want, right? But Mudit is saying that the social attitude is about how others should behave, right? And so there's a strong views around religion in India today. Nidhi.
So casteism is one, and next would be population.
Okay.
Casteism as in like what Mudit said about religion, I could relate more to casteism. As we tend to be more we have strong affection as an individual. We would definitely go for our small identities rather than recognizing ourselves more as an Indian. And population, because growing population, greater the demand, less the resources, and overall it would need to the economy. Either the economy will grow, either we will have the population as a liability or an asset. But today's scenario, I feel that our population, the growing population, is a liability to the government and the resources.
Okay, so Nidhi is pointing out to two important social attitudes. Right, first is those are associated with caste, and the second is those associated with population. Specifically, Nidhi is saying it's not your own behavior towards yourself, right? It's not your own behavior towards yourself, but your behavior towards everyone else, right? Your view on how other people should be behaving, right? Which is the point. So if you don't want to have children, don't have children. No, Nidhi says that in India today we have views on how many kids other people will have, right? And so that is the point around which. So it's not about just me and my choices. It's also me and my views on your choices, right? So Khushi and then Neil.
Sir, another social attitude would be girls' education, which was not promoted earlier. Girls are not allowed to be educated, and also they can't. Girls are not allowed to be educated, and they can't contribute in the earnings of the family. They are not allowed to work after marriage.
Okay, so Khushi is pointing out to this important, I think cleavage in Indian society, that how we treat women versus how we treat men is very different, right? And it has nothing to do with the inherent capabilities of men and women, which we all think are fairly equal, right? She's saying that there is a social attitude around how many men or how much we should invest in men's education versus how much we should invest in women's education. Plus, it's not just stops at education; it also extends to how much work is allowed. So men are expected to work, bring large paychecks home. Women, if they don't work, it's fine, and we always come up with reasons why they ought not to work, right? And so this is what Khushi is saying. And Nidhi also points out the fact that even if women did make it to the workplace, there is this large issue of pay parity, right? And so workplaces tend to say, okay, fine, we should, there are managers who come up with all sorts of reasons not to pay the women the same as men for the same amount of work. Incidentally, this is not just true in India, but even in the US, right? Right now, the running statistic is 81 cents to a dollar. So that means if you equate the amount of work and the kind of work that men and women do, then you end up with women earning 81 cents for every dollar that men make, right? So only 80% of the earnings, right? Neil?
Hi, sir. So I actually had a question. Would like you to go last?
Okay. So Ayushi?
Sir, the major social issue I feel which is impacting our economy is not enough economic opportunities and employability for the third genders. So
Okay, yeah, that's interesting, right? So we have a view on people from third gender, right?
yes.
And not only do we, so if you don't want to work, don't work. But you have a problem with other people working, and the definition of other people is based on their gender, right? And so, of course, the key thing is that their gender has nothing to do with their productivity, right? And yet it is tend to have a view on these things, right? So in this sense, I think what we see in the US social attitudes is also reflected in Indian social attitudes, right? So hopefully what this is indicating to you is that social attitudes are important. So they shape who we are, and therefore how we relate to others in society, right? And so this is what I want to talk about. And so I'm going to have in our discussion today talk about social attitude in two domains. Okay, so that's my objective of today's class. I'm going to talk about social attitudes in two domains. First, I'm going to talk about the domain on which you have the reading. Did you guys look at the reading?
Yes.
Skim through it? Yes? Okay,
Yes.
good. Okay, good. So, so second, I'm going to talk about some of my own research on social attitudes, right? So this is, love to get your views on both these topics. So let's be specific, right? In my first discussion, I want to talk about a very particular type of social attitude. And it has a name. It's called repugnance, right? And so repugnance says that I don't like something. Specifically, I don't like something about myself. No, that's not what it says. It says that I have a problem with your actions, even when they don't directly affect me, right? And so this is the idea of repugnance. It's a strong dislike, distaste, or antagonism of others' actions. And so particularly, here's an example of repugnance. So this did not come up in our discussion, but there are views on commercial surrogacy. So do all of you know what commercial surrogacy is? Yeah. So it's a market that exists. It's a market that used to exist in India, where a legal market that used to exist, where a couple that wants to have a child can implant the embryo into a woman, right? Into a woman's womb. The child is carried to term, and the woman who is carrying the child hands over the child to the couple, and in return she gets money, right? And so this is the notion of commercial surrogacy, and the Indian government has effectively banned it, right? So now there are very specific conditions under which commercial surrogacy can take place, but largely the market is banned. And so why is the commercial surrogacy market banned? What's the logic? Anuj?
So, sir, the donor for the commercial surrogacy goes through a lot of physical changes, and this may take a toll on her body if she goes for multiple commercial surrogacies to earn money. So this
Sure,
can
but she knows about that, right?
she might not know in depth.
Okay, so you're saying that's an information problem, but there are physicians who are quite expert, and there's no evidence that any of these women who are participating in this were, fully informed about the consequences of bearing children, right? And so, by the way, bearing children is an entirely natural process, right? So it's not as if it's something unusual. Of course, there are changes in body that happens when women bear children, but in this case, there's no evidence that any of these women were harmed by this experience, and in return, of course, they were paid a lot of money. So what is the problem with it?
I think one of the reasons could be that the lawmakers don't agree with the reasons that people enter, like people avail the service of commercial surrogacy. For example, it might be two gay people who want a child, and then they rent a womb effectively, but people don't agree with the same-sex couples having a child.
Okay.
So they banned it. That they have no other recourse. And similarly, for people who want to be single parents or anything other than married couples, basically.
Yeah, so Moses says that the problem was with the lawmakers; they didn't like this idea, right? So I think that is in so Moses says it's not about the people who are transacting; it's the lawmakers who had the problem, right? And so they were suffering from repugnance. Not of if lawmakers didn't like this idea of commercial surrogacy, the lawmakers were free not to participate in the market, but they just didn't like it, so they passed the law because they could, right? After all, they're lawmakers. And they didn't like the idea that someone else would do something, and so they passed the law. And so, Tamanna, what do you think?
So there is stigma around surrogacy procedure from surrogate mother around the child from the couple. Like they are not perceived as a fertile couple.
So Tamanna says that there is stigma associated with participating. Of course, none of the people who are participating have a problem. After all, if you feel stigmatized, don't participate. But the problem Tamanna is pointing out is other people, right? All society, uncles, aunties was then stigmatized, right? So those are the people who have the problem, not the people. Sahiti?
So I think it comes down to the fact that the lawmakers might feel that people should not get exploited for surrogacy. So just because they need money, it's not like they should get exploited too.
So that's true. I mean, so people, just because I need money, it means that I should not be exploited by having to work. That might be a concern, in every market out there, that if I, say in the labor market, in the employment market, that, did I get a fair price for what I offered? And it seems as if, most surrogates were paid well, and they were taken care of well, and there's very little evidence of anything bad happening as a result, right? So medically bad happening to either the mother or the carrier or the child as a result of this. So I think, most of you, I see some hands up still, right? We'll return to some of these points, but I think the long and short of it is that it's rare that any of the participants in the commercial surrogacy market had a problem with the transaction. It's basically everyone else, right? It's society in general. It's the lawmakers, right, who are pointing to these issues. What was the basic crux of their matter? We don't like it, right? That is basically it. So it's not the participants who had the problem, it's everyone else who had the problem. And what was their basic logical basis? We don't like it, right? And so this is the idea of repugnance in an important market, right? So they didn't like it so much that they basically banned the market from existence. And so this market does not exist, right? So my discussion today is not about commercial surrogacy. It's about something that you read about, right? And so you read about kidney transplants. And so, of course, one of the reasons why there are many people who have failed kidneys, right? And so this is quite a common condition. Unfortunately, in India, what has been happening is that as India became more prosperous, what did we do?
More lifestyle became more sedentary.
Yeah, no, right? So people became prosperous, and what did they do with their prosperity? Eat more sugar and fat and not exercise, right? So that's what we did. And so unfortunately, this has caused large-scale problems, particularly type 2 diabetes has exploded in India. And with some of these challenges have emerged in kidney failure, right? So this is a common issue that you have kidney failure. How do you deal with kidney failure?
Either through dialysis
Yeah.
or a kidney transplant.
Those are the two options, right? So there are two options, dialysis or kidney transplant. And so the dialysis is it a fun procedure?
No.
Right? It's
It's
terrible.
highly expensive.
It's expensive. It's time
Tiring
consuming.
for the patient as
Painful.
well. Like a patient gets drained out at the end of the day.
Yeah, it's draining for the patient. It's terrible. Right?
Yeah,
It's so
it's
current.
Any other, like if a person has any other disease, then there are high chances that the person may die. Most of them die.
Yeah. So dialysis, so kidney failure and dialysis are actually quite bad. So this is the case where the treatment is actually quite challenging, and infections and so on and so forth cause a lot of problems. And there is a fairly simple solution to the alternate, right? So apart from dialysis, what could you do? Kidney transplant, right? And are there enough extra
Medication.
kidneys in this world?
No.
Yes, there are. Yes, there are. Right? Yes, there are all. So, how many kidneys does everyone have?
Two.
Two kidneys.
Right? You have two kidneys. You have one, you have an heir and a spare, right? So, you have two kidneys. And do you really need two kidneys?
No.
We can
With one. No problem, right?
Yes.
And so this is the
But the
interesting.
problem is nobody wants to donate it.
Okay, hold on, Ankita. So Ankita is jumping ahead, right? So she knows, right? So this is the issue. So here is, some statistics from the US, which puts the data out quite frequently, is that there are 113 plus thousand people who are waiting on the transplant list, waiting for a kidney, right? Waiting for someone to donate a kidney. Unfortunately, only 36,000 transplants were actually performed, and 20 people die each day waiting for kidney, right? So just waiting for a kidney, 20 people die, and this is a big challenge, right? So you can imagine the amount of suffering that is happening because it's a widespread population-wide problem, and yet we have not had a solution in terms of getting enough kidneys, right? So all of us have extra kidneys, all of us could be contributing our extra kidney, and yet we don't do that, right? And so if you look at the kidney supply, the demand is high, but the supply is not. And so many people, there's a shortage, and many people die, right? So this is real human consequence. And this organ shortage has been there for quite a while. It's not the number of donors has not expanded over time. The number of transplants taking place is not very large. Instead, what has happened is that the waiting list has grown and grown and grown, right? And so now you have many hundreds and thousands of people waiting for kidneys. And so so of course, when you have problems like this, you have some economists, right, saying, we know the answer. The answer is a market, right? So let's have a market for kidneys. Let's have a kidney exchange just the way we have a stock exchange, right? You can buy and sell kidneys. And what will happen if the market price of kidneys is very high? What will happen to the supply of kidneys? Will people be willing to give their kidneys if they will get a lot of money for it?
Yes, sir.
More chances of it.
Yeah,
Yes.
right. So people will be willing to give, and of course, if there are too many sellers, then the market price will fall, and it all will work out, right? So that is the one answer. Let's have a market for kidneys. So what do you think about the market for kidneys? Should we have an idea? Should we have a market for kidneys? What are some of the